Hi, I'm Kevin,
And I'm Amanda.
and we are serving up.
All that jam. A lighthearted look at the weekend jam bands.
Where we break down the jam scene's biggest stories,
Talk new bands.
upcoming tours,
And show reviews. A little laughing, some hot takes, and an always positive message for the community.
Week of March 4th, 2024, Avram Brown.
Welcome back. This is All That Jam, where music has no limits. We have a lot to get into this week, including delving into the top 3 stories of the week. Plus, we have an interview with Avram Brown on his latest project, The Wheel, where he started and where he's going. Had a low and slow week in Baltimore and spent the time thinking about all that jam and how to make it better for you, the listener. I did catch Spafford busted out Red Slip and Squander last night with Jordan taking the vocal. It's been a good 15 months since Red left. Maybe more seems like the right time. Amanda, you remember they told us at the start of 2023 that one day these Red songs might come back, and apparently yesterday was that day. So that was good. How was your week?
Kevin, I like that terminology, low and slow. Yeah, it was it was a busy week, a lot of things happening, I think, behind the scenes. And just like you mentioned, and you especially, we're thinking about, just different things we can do here. And I'm excited. I think there's a lot of ways that we can continue to bring great interviews, but maybe spice up a little bit how we're sharing them out to you.
And if you're listening to this, pop in our DMs, send us a message on socials. Let us know what you think, what worked for you, what doesn't.
Yeah. So, you know what? I would say stay tuned. I think there's a lot of different fun that we could have going into the second half of this year.
Yeah. So I had a little peek at the stories coming up, and there is a universal theme almost to it. So why don't we jump in?
The top 3 stories of the week.
Okay, Kevin. So, yeah, as always, we have 3 stories this week. I'm going to start with, I think, the one that's probably the most straightforward. And this to me is just, another sign of the times. Nothing maybe new, but in this day and age, I think it bears some discussion. Universal Music Group has begun a round of layoffs that's thought to eventually get into the hundreds. Not completely unexpected. However, as I'm reading about the changes over there and some of the integrations of a lot of different labels, which I'll talk about in a minute, it just makes me think about how the ability to specialize in music, which is something we talk about a lot, seems to be getting further and further away when you look at the major corporations that are running the music industry. So let me just share a little bit about what's happening over at Universal, and then we can see what we want to chat about related to all of this. Now, you and I, Kevin, I know are not necessarily super connected to the mainstream music industry, but it does really signal in a lot of ways, I think, what might be happening elsewhere. So Chairman CEO Lucian Grange last fall had mentioned that there would be some layoffs. This happened after an earnings call. And so what happened is there's been some consolidation of the labels under Interscope on the West Coast, and then the Republic label on the East Coast, where Def Jam and Island are moving under Republic. So you have these different staffs that have been doing their work, kind of focused maybe on a slightly smaller audience, that are now all coming under this bigger umbrella. And because of that, there are a lot of, I'd say, power players that are leaving. So Capital Chair and CEO, her name's Michelle J. I'm not going to pronounce her last name because I don't know how to say it. She was named Billboard's Women in Music Top Executive of 2024 just last week. She's gone. And a lot of other prominent executives too, including Def Jam's, hold on one second, including some executives that have been in the business for a long time. So, Kevin, Is this even news?
Well, I'm assuming that the executives got a golden parachute out of this. I would probably think lower on the chain that there's repetitive jobs, and I guess those people are losing their jobs. Now, how does that going to affect what they did when the person from Def Jam and Island, which you know aren't completely different, but if you're specializing in one thing or the other, do you lose some of that? Does it become more homogenized?
Right. That's what I'm wondering too. In addition, of course, to everybody that is not going to have their role anymore. But what do we lose also, or what does the industry lose when you have longtime head of publicity leaving, being filled by someone else that's now going to be overseeing a much broader, bigger staff? To me, I wonder, if as time goes on, you see fewer and fewer corporations, of course, owning more and more.
Right.
And it just makes me think about, in a similar way to maybe some of the streaming profit sharing conversations that we have, the consolidation that continues to happen overall, and not just in music, means that you just have this, I would say, smaller funnel overall, or maybe less opportunities for people to find success because it all tends to be coming up ultimately through the same place.
Right. And Def Jam, hold on. And Def Jam, the beauty of what they did and why they were so successful is they did hyper specialize. They knew their audience. They knew what they had to do to sell their product to their audience. And when you have, Mr. Top Guy who specializes in nothing and is listening to Lawrence Welk still at home, you're going to not be as big a player as you were. You may save money now, but I think it's short-sighted. Down the road, somebody's going to pop up that's going to know the audience, and the artists are going to want to go there because that's going to be where they get the most traction.
Right. And it's all about efficiency. If you read some of the articles, the one I happened to find that had a little more information was in Variety. And of course, all the corp you speak, right? Strategic, organizational redesign, blah, blah, blah. They're saying it's going to generate over $250 million in savings. So, of course, right? That's where we're at. AI, we've talked about last week, and the cost savings that are inherent there. Everybody's trying to figure this out. What's happening, like you said, is we are losing character and we're losing that human element, like you said, of people who really know the part of the industry that they've been working in for a long time. And, it makes me think, what if Relics was run, by someone from the New York Times music department who listens to classical music all day? Is it going to be the same kind of publication? Whatever you might think of Relics, or other
Or
very
is it
things.
even get swept under, say, Rolling Stone?
Mm-hmm.
Rolling Stone doesn't necessarily, focus on jam bands. They may have a Dave Matthews article or something, but they're much more into the pop mainstream.
That's right. And I spend a bunch of time every week looking through all those websites for stories. And so you're absolutely right. And I think that perhaps, and I'd be curious, this is kind of a bold statement, but perhaps in general, the music listening public itself is not quite as specialized anymore. Maybe there's just in general a perception that there's less of a need to have to cater,
Because Spotify
uniquely.
tells you.
Yeah.
Spotify tells you what you're going to like next.
Yeah. So I'm not even necessarily sure who I'm mad at in this one, if I'm mad at anyone. I think it's more of just the current culture
Have we
of
gotten to the
where we
point
are.
where we just throw our hands up in the air?
No, we can't do that. But, it makes me, as always, really grateful that we are part of a community that really does value and work really hard to just keep that individuality, which I think is so not only interesting, but it's something that you just don't find in the same way in a lot of different kind of musical corners. I'm sure that the EDM and other folks would definitely disagree with that, but I'm glad that those pockets still exist.
And there it is.
Yeah, so that's our first story. The next one is a little bit complicated, Kevin, and I sent this to you. So this is kind of getting into some science, but I thought it would be interesting because occasionally on the show we will talk to artists about things like harmony, melody, funk, bringing in different styles of music and kind of part of musical theory as a part of, I guess, interacting with the audience. And it's a huge part of what artists do. They have so much knowledge about what's going to make the music that we love sound good to us and to them. And so I saw this article, and the title was Pythagoras Was Wrong. There are no universal musical harmonies. So this was a big study that was just released, and it kind of takes on this, I would say, very long-running thought that consonance, which is just a nice sounding combination of notes, comes together by very special, almost musical relationships between numbers, so that there are chords that are always going to be beautiful because of the ratio of those notes. And that deviation from those, so anything different, makes music dissonant or something that's a little jarring and unpleasant. And if this was thought to be kind of a universal maxim that for a listener, we would tend to pick out what sounds good, and that's going to be a very consistent thing. But researchers from the University of Cambridge, Princeton, and then another institute have found that maybe that actually isn't the case. And this was published in a journal recently that says in a regular listening environment, people may not actually prefer chords to be just perfect in these ratios, like Pythagoras thought. What they found is that people tend to prefer slight amounts of deviation from that, a little imperfection, because that gives life to sounds, and that is attractive. And that's what actually hooked me on this story, Kevin, because I feel like we just talked to someone, maybe even a couple of people recently, about that idea of music being human, which is not perfect. So let me just stop there and see kind of what you think about this whole idea.
Was it the interview with Bruno?
That's one of them. Yeah, so French producer. And I think we're going to actually have that published pretty soon, Kevin, right?
Yeah, maybe next Sunday or the Sunday after. Yeah, it's coming up soon. I took a class in my senior year of high school to fill a credit about writing music theory and like writing chords, taking a melody line and you had to write chords. And there were all these rules. You couldn't follow this chord with that chord, and if the notes did this, it couldn't do this. And I guess what this is saying is that's all BS, like everything else you learned in high school.
Right. And not only that, but one of the major reasons why you have this, I think, very well accepted theory being debunked potentially is because so far, for the last however many, hundreds and hundreds of years, any research on this topic has focused on Western music, Western instruments, and the culture around that. Part of this study, which I found really fascinating, is when you take instruments that are not typically considered familiar to Western music or audiences, gongs, bells, different kinds of percussive instruments, it all goes out the window. A lot of times those instruments aren't going to even kind of respect the traditional relationships between notes that we think of. So part of this, I think, is also branching out, finally maybe, to include a huge number of other pieces of instrumentation that maybe have not been studied so far.
It's interesting. It's a deep read. It's not something you're gonna.
Yeah,
it's not what you're gonna read sitting there waiting for your kid to finish gymnastics. Make sure you.
No, but I will say this. A lot of times I hear about these studies and I wonder, okay, how many people participated? How significant is this? I will say in this case, another reason why I thought this was maybe something interesting to bring up and share, there were over 4,000 participants in this particular online laboratory that was created for different countries. They had almost 24 different kinds of behavioral experiments. People were listening to chords and then giving a rating of how pleasant that was. Or they could even use this kind of online slide to adjust notes to make it sound more pleasant. And that resulted in something like 200,000 different judgments within these experiments. So they have a lot of data, which I think is a good way to maybe give this some credence. So we'll see. It's something to think about. We definitely talk about dissonance in certain types of jam band, like micro genres, and how repetition, right? Repetition can help us. But maybe that's not actually the story. Maybe it's that
we talked to a band, Kirkos, who were only 2 years in last week, and you listen to that, and some of that's sludgy and industrial, and not what someone would call pretty, but something that I find very soothing in the chaotic nature of it.
I agree. And I think, if anything, it's a challenge to this idea that a harmony can only be one thing, or chords have to be perfect in these very precise mathematical relationships with each other. There's more out there that can be pleasing to us. And a lot of it comes from other cultures. So I think it's a lot that might be unfamiliar to us, perhaps. I'm sure that people listening from other parts of the world may look at this and say, well, yeah, we know that. But that's just not something that's been for a lot of us, I think, in our kind of day-to-day. So something to think about. I will share the article. Like you said, it is not a quick read. I found myself stopping every so often to really just think about my own assumptions about music and what sounds good. And so it's a good one to kind of challenge yourself on a little bit. Which might be a good segue, Kevin, to our last story, which is about Phish. I had never heard this before, Kevin. I know you have such a great kind of grasp of Phish history. But I found this article on Jambase, just from a couple of days ago. And this particular moment in Phish's history that has been something I've never heard of. One thing that I had heard over time is that Phish as a band traditionally does not spend a lot of time playing back tape of their shows. I didn't realize that apparently there is an actual kind of hard and fast rule of no analyzing, whether that's at set break or after the show. So let me just stop there and ask you, is that something that you knew about, that rule?
That was the legend of Europe in '97, that they stopped analyzing in the winter of fall, late '96. And when they went to Europe, it was all out on the table, and it opened up those maybe doors that made them become who they are.
That's right. I didn't realize it was something that was so steadfast. That to me is what I find really interesting. So you're right. In that 96, 97 era, which we all talk so much about, especially 97. So it's kind of interesting, right? If you want to try to make some kind of correlation, that the band said, we're not going to talk about whatever happened on stage. And they didn't. It's not only that they said, we don't want to do this, but they got off stage. Yeah. And that was it. And,
Trey's so sensitive. He they don't let him see articles. He doesn't get on social media. Like the pissing in the ears thing from Bittersweet Motel, when he's reading the article, not long after that, he stopped engaging with any of that. He didn't want to know what people were saying because he took it, I think, a little too much to heart, instead of being like, that's some knucklehead on social media,
Yeah. And I think that a lot of people would probably be like that, but I can't imagine getting 4 people, 4 different humans with different levels of comfort or maybe needs to analyze things, because some people really have that inherent need to want to sit and investigate and be able to say, you know what, we're not going to do that. And there was a good kind of explanation from Paige in this article in Jambase that says it wasn't something they ever really planned to do. I can't imagine anyone really saying we're not going to do this from the beginning, but it seemed like it was something that kind of built up. And as tour went on, somebody would say something about, how that first set went. And then the other 3 would say, wait, we're not analyzing it. And then it just kept going. And I thought to myself, that takes a lot of strength. Maybe you get used to it. But then there was this moment, this Gotta Jaboo, and I actually went back and listened to it. So it was in Providence at the Civic Center, 1999, December. And, as the story goes, they came off stage and they knew that this particular version was just, it didn't do it, and everybody wanted to say something. They were all kind of just walking around, honoring the rule. And then finally, everybody kind of just started shouting out at the same time, like, what the hell just happened?
And
that's right. And I guess some of it had to do with maybe something that was going on with percussion at that time. And there was kind of an interesting explanation there.
It was written for Tony and Russ. So, it's basically Mike and Fishman were learning a cover. And I guess Fishman said he wasn't swinging, or he was swinging straight or something. They mentioned something about swinging.
Right. And I guess the solution at the time, like in the middle of the show, that Fishman decided to come up with was just play it louder. And he's trying. And basically after that conversation, they played it at Hampton and it was great, And so in that case, without that little bit of conversation or analysis, it may not even have ended up being recorded like it was. Right. But it sounds like they still do this. And I really respect that. And again, it's not something that I realized was such a kind of a diehard thing for them. But, I love that they can make that work.
Yeah, I wonder if any of them privately listen back and say, what's going on? Or if they listen to rehearsals, maybe. That might be the thing you listen to.
Right. And that wasn't really mentioned, what they do. There were some interesting examples of maybe, who was it? Fishman remembering that he was going on about a song that he loved that they did. And then Paige says, but wait a second, by virtue of you saying you really like this one thing, then I could, come to a conclusion that there were some other things that you didn't like as much that you're not talking about. I mean, that's, in a way, that's an extremely thoughtful approach. I guess they're used to it because it makes me feel like I would really be watching every word I said, but that's also not part of my culture either. Yeah. So
that's too deep. You're getting in too deep with that.
So I don't know. It was really interesting to see also a lot of first person quotes and accounts that are connected to this, because that is one thing that, like you said, it's kind of been part of the lore, the legend. It's been talked about. This definitely, I think, solidifies like, yeah, that's a thing. And I find that interesting because we do ask a lot of artists about that, right? A lot of bands, do you listen and what happens after? So
what I like to call the disconnect.
Because
normally they're like, yeah, when I walked off stage, I wasn't into it, and I listened back and it wasn't that bad.
Yeah, I mean, that tends to be a theme. Maybe by the time you're in the kind of public eye that Phish is, even if we think about 97, they were really already in a place where the tapes and everything were flowing, people were listening. Maybe it changes at a certain point.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
So, hold on.
All right. Well, there's our 3 stories for the week. 3 really interesting ones. And like you said, I think there does tend to be a little bit of a theme through those. I hadn't really even thought about that. But yeah, we'll continue to try to find good stories for everybody out there every week.
We will. All right. So we have this interview with Avram Brown coming up. He is a longtime sideman and producer who got his own project called The Wheel Together. This first clip, we're going to get into his origin and his work as a sideman and a producer. And also Amanda asked about the Denver scene because he had lived out there for a few years. So let's check this out. So yeah, let's jump in with how'd you get your start? Would somebody put a guitar in your hand? Did you one day wake up and say, "Hey, this is my life"?
I mean, I really just remember being a little kid and being surrounded by music and a huge record collection and a record player and just learning how to put a record on the turntable and, play the record and just listen to it is kind of my earliest memories. When I was like 5 years old, I was, for whatever reason, really, really gravitated towards Sergeant Pepper. So I was like obsessed with the Beatles. And I remember putting the record on and like turning the speakers, pointing them outside into the street and opening the windows at my mom's house, putting on my roller skates and like roller skating back and forth on the street, just like yelling along with the music. So before I ever started playing music, I just loved music and just wanted to sing along. And I've got dancers in my family, so music was just like always a thing. As far as playing guitar, yeah, when I was like 14, I think about 14, somebody gave me an acoustic guitar as a gift. Not a family member, a friend of the family. And that was sort of, I immediately was like, how do I learn how to sing a Bob Dylan or John Lennon song? So really like singer-songwriters and like folk music was kind of my focus in the beginning.
What did you do before? We're going to get to the wheel and this new project you have going on, but you are a producer. What have you been doing before your studio work? What was your gig, your thing before this debut release?
Yeah, so for years, I was a sort of a hired gun guitar player, and playing guitar kind of became a big focus for me for many years, and obviously still is. But it was kind of like all I did, and then at somewhere along the line, I just like sort of fell in love with the idea of production. I was in some studio sessions and just watched somebody really work their magic in a way that blew me away. And I was like, how is it possible that you can make the sounds in your head come out of the speakers? And so I just became sort of obsessed with trying to understand that. And I guess organically that resulted in like buying studio gear, like entry level gear, like nothing fancy in the beginning, and trying to learn how to use it. And so that sort of dovetailed being just a session or touring guitarist to trying to make records. And I felt, or at least just songs. And I felt like the easiest way I could do that in the studio was with other people's music. And so I just started, I moved to LA and I literally put up flyers with like my phone number and I was like, and my email address. I'm like, I'll make your demo for cheap. Let me learn how to do the studio thing with you. And that's really how it all started.
So what names am I going to know that you've worked with?
Oh man. So, a couple full length albums that I did a few years ago, by a jamgrass group called Cascade Crescendo. And on that record, I got to work with the fiddle player Allie Crawl. I got to work with Anders Beck, played some dobro. I think they're from, I always forget which is from which, Green Sky Bluegrass, and maybe you can help me out here, was the other one that Allie's from.
Yonder Mountain String Band?
Yonder Mountain. Yeah, I don't think Allie plays with Yonder anymore, but she did.
Yeah.
So members of both those groups were on the record, on both records actually. And so Cascade Crescendo did some work with a woman named Mozella a few years ago. She ended up really blowing up as a songwriter more than as an artist. Yeah, I mean, those are just some names of some folks I've worked with.
So you mentioned like when you're listening to music, who do you love to either go see live or listening to these days, or even just historically? Because I know you're from the New York area, so lots of great, bands coming out of there for sure.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So, I mean, so much to be talked about here because, whether it's dub reggae or jazz music or rock music or traditional North Indian music, like I could go on and on. You know, some of the jam band stuff I really, really like as well these days. You know, Kevin mentioned the Grateful Dead. Obviously, the Grateful Dead is a huge influence. You know, there's a long tradition of bands that are named after songs. The fact that my project is called The Wheel is not an accident. I don't know
It's
if
a
you guys
nod.
know this. I don't know. A lot of people don't know this, but there's a song by the Talking Heads called Radiohead, which
Yeah.
is where they got their name. So obviously, the Grateful Dead, Jerry Garcia, Robert Hunter, their writing is a huge influence on me. Jerry's playing, the way they would improvise, Jerry Garcia band, but also, you know, like I deeply respect and love jazz and have studied jazz music. Grant Green as a guitar player is an enormous influence on me. Going back to Charlie Christian, Django Reinhardt, Wes Montgomery. But lately, I'm sort of obsessed with a newer artist out of LA. he's a Puerto Rican guy that moved to LA that does like live dub reggae music. So it's dub, but he plays all the instruments himself. And then he has like a mixing console on stage, and he actually like mixes the dub mix and sings over it and plays keyboards over it in real time.
Wow.
And so he's sort of top of mind. His name is Pachiman.
Okay.
And he's sort of fresh on the top of my head because he was just at the Crystal Ballroom the other night, and I went and saw the show, and it was fucking phenomenal. I love dub reggae music, Lee Scratch Perry, Augustus Pablo, like all that stuff. King Tubby.
Have you heard Dan Africano's Death by Dub?
What is it?
Dan Africano, the bass player from Thievery Corporation, right, Amanda? Mm-hmm. He has something called Death by Dub.
I have not, but I would love to.
I'll send you some links. It's basically kind of a supergroup collective. They've got members of Dopapod, Break Science, a bunch of bands, most of which are based where I live in Denver. And
cool.
Yeah, they it's a really cool thing. They kind of come together and have this long-standing project. So whenever they're all in town, they'll play usually.
Who from Break Science is in it?
Borum.
Okay.
Yeah.
Break Science is a duo, right? With Adam Deitch? Yeah. So Borum's the one I don't know. So Deitch I know from my years in Boston. That's great that you're in Denver. Yeah, Deitch and Schmeens from Lettuce. Those guys are good buddies.
The John T, DJ Williams, Dopapod guys, all kinds of people are out there in Denver. It's the Mecca.
Nice. And who's that dub? There's that, what are they called? They do like dub interpretations of classic records. So they do like Dark Side of the Moon and
Dark Side of the Moon. Yeah, I've heard of it.
Yeah.
And there's OK Computer. They did Radiohead's OK Computer in dub as well.
Yeah. I think they name themselves after whatever project they're doing, but I'm not sure who the actual people are in the collective there.
They're pretty amazing. I love those records.
It's so, yeah. I mean, we were talking to the guy, to Yak Attack, who are a band from out, right? Aren't they out in Oregon? Mm-hmm. Isn't that where they were?
Yeah.
And they do live looping. He has a computer up on stage, and then they run a click track to the drummer, so they're sure that they can hit what they're needing to, which I found fascinating because you talk to some jam bands and they're like, we don't need a click track. And I'm like, you guys need a click track. You would be so tight if you had a click track.
So that's Yak Attack is what's his name?
Dave, I forget. Dave is the first name for who we chatted with. He's kind of a long-standing member.
He's the keyboard guy. It's been his project, and the two new guys he has, the bass and drum guys. I don't have my notes in front of me. So it's three guys. Yeah.
I was just trying to remember because I know at one point there was a drummer in the band that was the brother of the drummer in Snarky Puppy, and he plays on the two Cascade Crescendo records that I mentioned that Ali Crawl, Anders Osborne.
I do believe Snarky Puppy came up.
Sorry.
I believe Snarky Puppy came up in our conversation with him.
Yeah, is that Nick Worth?
Nick Worth.
Nate's Snarky Puppy. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, so Nick is on drums on two of the Cascade Crescendo records I produced. So I've worked with Nick.
Nice.
Oh, that's fantastic. It
I knew
all,
there
it
was
all
a connection to Yak Attack. Yeah, it all circles back to
yeah,
Yak Attack, apparently.
that's, we should investigate that.
Yeah, we should.
All right, Kevin, this is a really great interview. I know we've got it broken up into a couple different sections. We will get back into our interview with Avram Brown in a minute. He'll be talking about his influences on songwriting and his process for songwriting. But before we do that, please make sure that you are following along on social media at All That Jam Pod on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, also on YouTube. And I would definitely subscribe and pay attention to that channel because I think there's going to be some really fun stuff coming up there as the year goes on. I know we're going to hear a bit about what's coming up this week after, but why don't we get back into our interview with Avram Brown?
Who would you say are your influences when you, as a songwriter? Who do you look to as being maybe your Mount Rushmore?
Oh, wow. Obviously the Beatles, enormous influence, not only lyrics and melodies, but also like just the whole philosophy of how they approach the studio is like, just because something doesn't make sense doesn't mean it isn't something that could work. Bob Dylan, of course, just a master. Obviously the combination of Robert Hunter and Jerry Garcia, and even just Robert Hunter as a lyricist, like when you take the music out of it, like there's some really profound things
Brilliant,
that
just brilliant.
he stumbled across.
Yeah, he was part of the experiments at Stanford where they gave people LSD and they lived on campus, and he got mega dosed. And apparently he sat around and read Emerson and Hawthorne and all these kind of things. And next thing you know, he's writing The True Tale of America.
It's not surprising. I mean, that was his generation, right? The whole Jack Kerouac and all that stuff. Lawrence Ferlinghetti. Yeah. I would say, as far as more contemporary songwriters, I'm a big fan of Jeff Tweedy. His solo stuff as well as Wilco, of course. I also really enjoy the way he writes. He's published a few books now, but he also has at least one poetry book that I think is really quite beautiful. Neil Young, huge influence on me. Lyrically and melodically. Tom York and Radiohead, and Tom York's new project, The Smile. I would probably, those are some of the biggest influences. Beck, the sort of the softer, less tongue-in-cheek side, the more authentic, folky Beck. There's a lot of Becks to the Beck.
There are a plethora of Becks.
Yeah.
And that's okay. Yeah.
I'm also a huge fan of Father John Misty. He can get quite verbose, but he's really stumbled across some pretty profound things that feel bigger than him. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really the theme, right? Is when the narrative and the whether it's the melodic or the lyrical picture that you paint feels sort of bigger than you're onto something. And I feel like the studio or the band or the producer or the combination of any of these ingredients can sort of act as like a multiplying effect, or like almost creates that kaleidoscopic result where it like expands and blooms into something that has more facets to it than you could just do on your own. And I think great songwriting, the song sort of reveals itself and asks for what it wants. And I think, a great producer and artist combo, if they're going to really give the song what it wants, it's a lot less like adding stuff and a lot more like a sculptor chipping away and finding something inside, if that makes sense.
When you're in there and you listen to a band, I'm sure that in your head you have a vision of what this band could be and what it should sound like. How do you balance that against what the band wants and their vision of it?
Great question. Yeah. So I think, first of all, you always want to respect what the band's intention is. So if the band comes in and it's clear to me in like a pre-production session, like a rehearsal session, what my vision for the band would be, ideally what I'm hearing in my head is very much a more developed expression of what they intend. If it's something drastically different than their intention, then I may not get what they're trying to do, and it may not be a fit for me as a producer. And that's okay. Not every artist and every producer are made to work together. But generally, I will kind of intuitively get what they're going for. Maybe we'll talk about it a little bit. I often do pre-production with artists where we try to move the arrangement around. Sometimes I'll even change a chord progression a little bit or add a little motif or ask an instrument to double another part with another instrument that they're not normally doing. A lot of that happens in pre-production. And if the band is excited about the changes we're trying, and it's not like, hey, we're making these changes, it's more like we're trying these ideas to see if they work. If they're excited about doing new things and sort of imagining a more developed version of a song or a group of songs, then it's probably going to work out. And our vision's probably pretty aligned. If there's a lot of friction there, it can be really challenging. But I have yet to work with an artist that isn't open to this philosophy, which is every idea is worth trying. Doesn't mean every idea is going to work, but it's worth trying. And we'll only know if it's going to work if we try it. So let's just try every idea.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I love that. So you played the live show. What are your plans? Are we going to see a tour in 2024 of The Wheel?
Yeah, so I'm working on that now. More will be revealed. I certainly hope so. Yes.
All right. Well, I guess we knew he was going to say Robert Hunter was an influence, being called The Wheel. So
You would think so.
you would think so. So let me tell you what's coming up the rest of the week, and then we'll jump back in with some talk about The Wheel and the recording process. Tomorrow, Tuesday, we have Disco on the live experience. They're out on the road, so you can catch them live. I believe they're out west at this point, Colorado maybe. On Wednesday, we have Claudio Corona, who is an Italian musician, and his latest project, he was working with Alan Evans and Lettuce, members of Lettuce. On Thursday, we have Eric McFadden on Sergeant Splendor. Friday, getting to know Molly Miller. She is a fantastic guitar player, and you'll get to hear the name of her childhood band. On Saturday, we have Rob Lind, who is a member of the Sonics, which in my mind are one of the original punk bands, pre-punk bands, and fascinating. We get a short history of the Sonics. And then on Sunday, John Trupp from New Potato Caboose, which is a band that was huge on the East Coast. No one else really knew about them. They had some catchy songs. They were around the God Street time, Spin Doctors, Blues Traveler, but they never got the jump. But that's on Sunday. Fascinating thing. As for now, let's jump back into this Avram Brown interview, and we'll see in a minute. What label is it released on, I guess? Let's start there.
It's on Lakeshore Records.
Lakeshore Records. Okay, now, what was your marketing campaign going to be? Were you thinking I need to get on Spotify on playlist, or is it something where I'm going to go organically and just bring people on board?
I didn't even think about releasing the music. Like I made the record. I took Rick Rubin's advice and I made the record I wanted to hear. And then everything else I figured out when it was done. It was more like, what is this thing? And then the only thing I knew for sure when it was done was I wanted to hear what it sounded like on vinyl.
Okay.
And so it was really about like, okay, if there's going to be some kind of commercial element, a record deal or marketing, whatever, I want to just make sure there's vinyl somehow in the picture.
Right.
That's the only thing I knew for sure.
Did you record digital or did you record to analog?
It's all digital, but with a ton of vintage analog gear in the mix. So a lot of cool old mics and preamps, and just a lot of outboard gear, and trying to capture that as sort of realistically as possible. And then it was also, even though it was mastered to a digital file. It was mastered on an analog console as well. And so when Adam Gonzalez at Telegraph Mastering mastered the record, he did master it for digital, but he also mastered it directly to a lathe. So he has an old vintage lathe. I want to say it's like from the 1930s or 40s, where you actually like cut you cut the lacquer in real time. It's so cool. Like it has this little like camera on the lathe. So once you cut a groove on a record, you can actually zoom in on the groove and see the wave physically.
They're so neat. I've seen the microscope pictures.
Yeah. So to see your own music that way is just like holy shit, this is really happening. Like I'm finally making a proper record, which is how I fell in love with music in the first place.
Frankie and the Witch Fingers, when we spoke to them, they were saying that they recorded digitally, but mixed everything down to analog tape. And then that's what they used to release everything. And I don't know that much about it, but you're a producer, so maybe you can help me. I've always felt like analog was warmer. And if you look at a wave, it's a wave. It's smooth. Digital is like little steps. Do you think recording in digital and going to analog does anything to improve the quality of it or give it that warmth?
I think it depends on where in the process you do it. I mean, certainly analog, if used properly, can be significantly warmer sounding. I think the idea of a physical medium is powerful, right? I mean, at the end of the day, our ears are vibrating from waves that are coming out of some kind of speaker, whether it's a closed speaker with a headphone or a distant speaker. And it's a physical experience. So if there is, as much of that physicality that's sort of respected and maintained between the original instrument that's actually vibrating in some way, whether it's a string vibrating through a magnetic pickup through another speaker with an amp, or whether it's just a drum getting hit with a stick or whatever it is, the fewest number of bleeps and bloops, right? Zeros and ones that you can have in the equation, and the purest you can get from like the physical reality to your ear experiencing it physically, I think you're going to get something that is profoundly more organic. That doesn't always mean that's the sound an artist wants, though, right? Sometimes artists want to bit crush shit and make shit weird.
And auto-tune.
Yeah. I just had this thought and I had to Google it because I wasn't sure if it was a thing, because I'm toying with it as like a potential album name someday. 8-bit folk. I just think it would be a cool concept, right? Where you have like bit crushed, weird lo-fi shit combined with folk songs.
This land is our land, the 8-bit version.
Right. Yeah.
So I saw that you have a video out for Coyote Mask and then a visualizer on your YouTube page for Love and Truth. Are you planning to continue that for the other songs on the album, or were those kind of set up to help introduce people, to the songs?
Great question. I actually just got an edit of another visualizer this morning from an amazing video sort of creator. He also does a lot of cool like visuals for live music, a lot of projection visuals. I think more visualizers would be awesome. I'm not sure about like official performance music videos with like me or the band or something on camera, but certainly I think releasing more videos that are sort of carry the vibe of the music in some way would be cool.
Yeah, the visualizer thing is pretty nice. The way that I tend to think of it is it kind of creates a mood or a tone that you would like to set, but I feel like it also gives a lot of freedom to the person watching as well to continue that in whichever way they want. Is that true for you, or is there maybe another reason why you like those? Because I'm always fascinated when I see those for music.
No, I love that interpretation completely. I think the whole idea, it's kind of like lyrics, like if a songwriter tells you what they meant by their lyrics, it kind of you lose that sort of, I don't
Trey.
know. What happened with Trey?
All of Trey's new stuff, I say he gives you the parable without the story. is how I put it. Everything's right, just hold tight. There's no more I threw the witch in the ditch and pulled the blade back on her or something like that. There's no story. It's only this is the way it is. And I want the story because it makes me listen. I've listened to Jack Straw 500 times in my life by the Grateful Dead because the story changes every time you listen to it.
There you go. I mean, so that's it, right? So if the story changes every time you listen to the same set of lyrics, then certainly a visualizer can leave you to experience something on your own. I mean, I remember being in high school and like watching Pink Floyd The Wall, right? Like that's such a very specific story. But there's so much there that you could like I feel like you sort of think about The Wall for years after watching it. And sometimes it just pops up in your head. Like there's a moment that happens in life that just reminds you of that or like some specific section. But yeah, I think the idea of a visualizer also is like, it's so funny because the psychedelic sort of kaleidoscopic visualizers for me really just remind me of what I see when I close my eyes and meditate or what I see when I close my eyes on psychedelics or if I'm at a jam band show, you know, that those kind of images can just be in the room with the band and the audience, right? So for me, it's like an act of meditation, if that makes sense. Like, you know, if you can give somebody music and something visual to sort of get lost in, then their mind can kind of hopefully be occupied with something soothing that is healing. And because there's so much chaos in the world and there's so much to be upset about, right? And to kind of get lost in something beautiful.
You need a moment of zen.
Yeah, it's just a gift. And it's a gift that I feel like I was given as just a lover of music. And so the fact that I can make something come out of headphones or speakers that's going to give a similar gift is something that I cherish and I really value a lot.
Kevin, another great interview, and I know we've got a whole bunch lined up as well, so always excited for that. I would just say if you were on Jam Cruise or following along, because I know, for example, that Live for Live Music published daily updates of what was happening on the boat. I'm looking for people's favorite moments from Jam Cruise, which may or may not connect to an official set. I know there's so much that happens, during that week. So looking to have some fun memories to share in the next week or two.
Yeah, people showing up in the piano bar, just playing a little piano or something like that. Sometimes that's the best stuff. All right, with that, let me say, stay beautiful, but don't stay underground too long. I'll see you next week, Amanda.
All right, Kevin, have a great week.